think that's also what they're doing. They're becoming the harvest information about the readers for marketing reasons. So it's a very complex transformation of the media. It's not the traditional get up in the morning, have your coffee and tea with the iron paper. Those days have gone. I think we're now in a transitionary period.
I think, yeah, what you say, Adrian, is right. And I think one of the reasons for this also is, of course, that you get your headlines and your main stories from listening to radio or watching the television. I would also like to endorse what Ian said, that I always say that any journalist who says that he has never made a mistake is either a fool because he doesn't recognize his mistake, or a liar. So nobody is totally and utterly trustworthy. But I do think that public service broadcasting, if it is genuinely independent, somewhat on the lines of the BBC, does play a very valuable role, although they can get things wrong, and the BBC has notoriously been in trouble recently for getting things wrong. But in a world where nothing is perfect, certainly I think public service broadcasting has a valuable role to play.
Right, so at this point, I think I'd like to open it up for questions. We have 10 minutes left, so please ask, raise your hands and we'd be passing on the microphones. Is there somebody to pass the microphone? I don't need it anymore. I think you would be the one who would ask questions.
I have a small question for Mr. Mark Tully. Around 3 years ago, in one of your observations, you had said that the two biggest problems for India and the subcontinent particularly are the two Ds. One is democracy and the other is demography. This was in the context of the Tatas and company packing off from Singur with their car industry. Now, along with the two Ds, would you care to add C, corruption? Particularly sometime in the middle 80s, The Economist had brought out an editorial in India, politics and crime are allied professions.
Well, all I'd say very briefly in answer to that, corruption's a huge subject. I think corruption is more a symptom of something which is wrong rather than the actual cause of it. And I do think that the one thing which I'm always saying, that the real thing which really needs to be attended to in India is governance. And if you can improve your governance, then your corruption will go down very greatly. And in governance, I would very much include the legal system. In governance, I would also very much include the legal system and the way the legal system operates. And for those of you here who are lawyers, and Calcutta is famous for lawyers, I was talking recently to a very eminent lawyer of India, and he said to me, it's not just the legal system we need to reform, it is the lawyers themselves. And he pointed out an interesting fact to me, that in India, you have the practice of lawyers appearing, say, maybe in 4 different cases in one day. And he said, and I'm not saying this because I'm British, but I'm saying this because he said it, that in Britain, you are basically in danger of being debarred as a barrister if you appear in one case, in more than one case in a day. So I think that the C problem is a lot, at least, to do with governance and reforming the law and reforming the way that lawyers themselves behave.
Hello. Good afternoon. Just a simple question. All of you have been independent voices. Put my question. Okay, that's. Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask that being independent voices coming in, objective voices, Can you comment on the Indian media's coverage of these so-called disasters? I mean, starting right from, let's say, Operation Bluestar till what we've had now, till recently. Would you think that the Indian media's coverage, I mean, what would you like to say on that? Has it gained credibility, lost some of its credibility? How is the Indian media, newspapers, for example, how are they covering it? I mean, what would be your comment on it?
This working? It does work. Fantastic. Lovely. I mean, I think most foreign correspondents here do depend to a large extent on Indian reporters. I mean, I can't speak any known Indian language. I can maybe understand a little, but not very much. So, I mean, my work here depended on people who understood the country better than I did. I mean, that's the simple truth. And so they may have their faults, but I think we need them. And I think that India's lucky in one respect, which is that its newspapers are growing in number and in circulations, not declining. So that reporting here actually has the potential to be healthier than anywhere else that I know. In Europe and North America, newspapers are everywhere in steep decline, losing money, and reporting is shriveling as a consequence. So I think with the right kind of proprietor, and maybe we could argue about what that proprietor, who he would be, but with the right kind of proprietor and the right kind of ownership, journalism here can really flourish because it still makes money.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that while there are many extraordinarily good writers and reporters who we do rely on and need and we cherish and read what's written, I think increasingly the ethos of newspapers is not to dwell, not to deconstruct, not to mine too deeply, and to be part of the political status quo, whichever status quo is backing the paper. Mumbai is a really clear example of that. I think there was a failure really to mine down into the events surrounding 26/11. There was a huge push to move on by 2009. When I looked at the Pradhan Commission report that came out in 2009, it just filled me with worrying concern that the only official government document could be 64 pages long. And yet Pradhan was kind of, it was what it was, and everyone moved on. I felt that there was no attempt really to get beneath Pradhan, or even to examine the fact that the remit, for example, was so narrow that poor Pradhan himself complained later that he had an albatross around his neck and felt that he was being hung out to dry. I think that actually is a problem, the lack of ability to reflect in detail. Newspapers are not concerned to do that. If you look at Outlook as a news magazine has dwindled in size. India Today is moving more into digital media. You have independent outlets like Caravan and Open, which are seen as the quality end of reportage that's being sponsored by corporations. But I think there's far more need for independent voices that will dwell longer on stories.
I'd like to really put a question to Adrian, actually, which I think is on a different level, but very important, and that is the role of breaking news in disaster coverage. Because I think breaking news is extremely dangerous. And I think that the coverage, from what I've read and from Adrian's book as well, in particular, the breaking news coverage of the Bombay attack on the Taj was extremely damaging, actually, as I understand it. And this whole concept of just having reporters there gabbling away without being in a position to have any information, without proper information, and often getting themselves into a position where they obstruct the security forces is very dangerous. But I think that's something Adrian can talk about better than I can.
I think things changed after 26/11 drastically. I mean, if you look at the reporting that took place after Westgate in Nairobi, the first thing they did when the Westgate siege set in was to close down the site, create a perimeter, and then shut off all reporting. So whether or not, one result of that is we have no idea what happened inside there. The bad side is we still actually really don't understand who did it or how many there were. But that's actually to do with another corrupt nexus between the government and the media. But actually one good side of that was that there was no rumour mongering. Yeah. So in essence, the running commentary that led to the successful manipulation and ventriloquism of the terrorists, that was solved. That problem was ended. I mean, that was the crisis in Mumbai, that everything that Barker reported and everything that appeared on Ajtal was then going back to Karachi, where they were watching it on their screens, and they then rang up the guys on the ground and said, you know, actually in room 628, there's a really good banker, and you should go and get him. Now, of course, that ventriloquism, we realised that for the first time, and I believe there is a lesson learnt with that in the control of media. Yeah. There's a responsibility that comes with access. Yeah.
Yes. Mr. Adrian, as a younger journalist, you know, there's always a blame game. Like take the case of Kashmir, you know, the militants blame the Indian military, you know, and reportage, you see, from Syria, where the photojournalists are most endangered, you know, going into the midst of the mess over there, you know. So, like in the case of chemical weapons, you know, the usage of whether the Bashar al-Assad used it against those who were wanting democracy, or the other side used it. Still, the media is not giving a very clear account, and we have certain, you know, biased versions sometimes, you know. So, what do you say about that? Like this blame game, and when the true reporting is not done, you know. And what's your opinion? Followed by Mr. Mark Tully, please.
Is this me or you?
No, I'm asking Adrian, please.
Adrian,
yes.
you
As
go.
a younger
well, I'll just have a stab at it, although you haven't asked me.
Please do.
Anxious to make my presence felt. I feel that the journalism lets us down a lot in this area. I can only speak from the point of view of Britain, I guess, here, but we tend to have this habit of invading countries with very little understanding of what these countries are in terms of their religious composition, their economic problems, their tribalism, whatever, their politics. Iraq, of course, was a striking example of that ignorance. Although there were clever people who said to Blair and presumably to Bush, don't do it, their concerns are overridden. More strikingly, I think, more recently is Libya, in which there's a tendency, journalism likes this kind of scenario, really, in which there's a very bad man. And if you get rid of this very bad man, everything will be fine. So the very bad man in Iraq was Saddam Hussein, the very bad man in Libya was Colonel Gaddafi, and the very bad man in Syria is Assad. So it appeals to a certain kind of journalism, that, and it's a simple thing to believe. And it's led British foreign policy, if I may say so, into many, many traps. Such now that I think you would never command assent from the population at large for a further foreign adventure on Britain's part.
Yeah, I remember being in a Foreign Office briefing, in fact, two remarkable ones, one in London and one in Washington, where I became pretty sure at the end of both of these briefings on different occasions, this was after the African embassy bombings in 1998 in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, where the briefer actually did not know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. And I left those meetings filled with a new sense of fear for what was going to happen afterwards. And the entire power axis that was misunderstood. And then that became manifest in 2003 because there was no understanding of the way in which Iran may be buoyed by the unseating of Saddam and the effects in Syria and the backfire, the blowback in Syria with the relationships between Hezbollah and Assad and the corridor leading into Israel. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Every action has a reaction. And the understanding of the fine detail is what matters to me more than ever, the over-complexity. I said the other day, when someone says Taliban, you say, which Taliban? When someone says to you, they're talking about a group within, let's say, Wahhabism, you want to know what's the jurisprudence. You want to know, You know, is it the Hadithis you're talking about, and within that, which movement? You know, these are now legitimate questions. More detail, not less. More complexity, more nuance, more knowledge. I think Iraq showed us that we need more complexity, and that we have to find simple language to explain it as journalists.
Yeah, I would. I don't know. Is this working? I'd like to go back to the question of Afghanistan. We all, and us journalists as well, assumed that the Soviets going into Afghanistan, very bad thing. Afghanistan must be liberated, and therefore the most ludicrous methods were used to help the Mujahideen. These methods have been, to a large extent, responsible for all the arms which have swamped Pakistan and Afghanistan. And we never even asked a very simple question: might it not be better just for us to leave the Soviets there and let them collapse, because they would inevitably have done so if we had known anything about the Afghans, the way the Afghans fought, the way they were able to deal with traditional armies. As it was, we played a major role in creating the mess that there is in Afghanistan, and the mess which I sadly believe will continue for some time to come. We just simply, as journalists, and I think I was guilty in many ways of this, we simply took the simplistic view: Soviets there, bad thing, and therefore any steps which are taken to get rid of the Soviets are justified.
Is there a microphone there?
Yes.
Yeah, so could you, yeah.
My question is on social disaster. I think it's one thing to have disasters such as the Bhopal gas tragedy of 26/11 and be able to report on that. But then if you take the case of the recent rape that happened in West Bengal, a gang rape of a tribal girl, which might have been a case of over-reporting internationally, because it was an isolated case. And yet there are other social problems such as female feticide, malnutrition.
I do think there is a real problem now with all sorts of issues which come up, that you get a tragedy like the Delhi rape case, for instance, which was appalling, and nobody can deny that. But the danger is that the media so concentrates on this and goes on and on talking about this to the exclusion of a whole lot of other things, but also gives the impression that rape is more prevalent in this country than it actually is. And the other day I was in a ludicrous position. I always had this problem: when you ask to go on the television, you say you don't want to, but in the end you get almost bullied into doing it. And this question of what the Aam Aadmi law minister said and what the black Africans said, ladies said, and then this led to all the media everywhere asking these questions about, are Indians racist? Now, I think there's a very fine balance to be caught here. We must not ignore the problem of racism in India. We must not ignore the problem of rape. We mustn't stop reporting rape cases. But at the same time, we mustn't exaggerate these things and give the impression that the problem is far greater than it is.
I mean, I agree with Mark entirely. I think that the media has a kind of excitability which is difficult to control now. I mean, people just watching one of those TV screens in this country in which you've got, the Bombay Stock Exchange across the bottom, something translated from English into Hindi above that, and then 4 little boxes with excited talking heads. It's very wearing. I mean, it's very wearing. Ian Foster said something once about human beings, which he said a more perfectly adjusted organism would be silent, and I often think that's the case. I think a bit of silence is much called for here. But as for your point, I mean, if we're reporting rape, are we missing out on these many other kind of silent things which are not dramatic? is a very good one. And I think journalism finds that slow, silent condition a very, very hard thing to write about. It's very, I mean, P. Sainath did that series in the Times of India, which I thought was admirable on village life in India. And I think in this city, I think of a man called Ian Stevens who edited The Statesman here long ago and found suddenly there were bodies in the streets of Calcutta in 1943 and wondered what to do about it because it was a part of the British Empire. And his paper was owned by an English company, and solved the problem by just printing pictures on the front page of The Statesman, which was the first time the Bengal famine really had international attention. So sometimes there are ways of doing things which aren't about words, but are about pictures. But I think it's a very difficult thing to write about.
Yeah, I think there's an infectiousness as well. I remember spending ages on an untold scandal in Northern Ireland, one of the few jobs that I was asked to do that wasn't in South Asia. And it involved a series of tragedies which really brought into question the effectiveness of the Good Friday Agreement, the supposed peace that took place after the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And what it amounted to was loosely speaking, an